Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Ambassador for the Red Flag Group. I would like to welcome you to episode 31 of This Week in FCPA for the week ending December 2nd, 2016, the Government Speaks edition. In this episode, Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen, and I talk about the release of the eBook Trump and Compliance by Corporate Compliance Insights. It's a compilation of work by the X-Men of Compliance on the Everything Compliance podcast. I give my wrap-up remarks on the FCPA Mock Trial Institute. We talk about Matt Ellis's new book release, The FCPA in Latin America. Then we turn to the interview by Richard Bistrong of Barry Vitou on the future of the Serious Fraud Office in the United Kingdom, which appears on the FCPA blog. We conclude with a lengthy discussion about remarks by government regulators at the recent ACI 33rd Annual FCPA Conference in the Department at Washington. It includes Sally Yates from the Department of Justice, Andrew Ceresny from the Securities and Exchange Commission, Kara Brockmeyer from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and Daniel Kahn. We conclude with a wrap-up of the Cowboys' win over the Minnesota Vikings last night, now at 11-1, the top record in the NFL, and the injury to Patriot tight end Rob Gronkowski and how that may affect the Patriots going forward. This is Tom Fox. I'd like to thank you for listening to This Week in FCPA. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and I'd like to welcome you to this episode of This Week in FCPA, the Government Speaks edition. It is for the week ending December 2nd, 2016. As always, I'm joined by Mr. Translations himself, Jay Rosen. Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Tom. Great to be with you, and look forward to wrapping up this FCPA week with you.
So we had actually a pretty interesting week, so I thought maybe we could just jump right into it. First of all, we wanted to tell everyone about the release of the first ebook from the, as Jay calls us, the X-Men of Everything Compliance podcast. Jay, why don't you tell us a little bit about the ebook?
Sure. So this is a couple weeks ago, Mike Volkov, Matt Kelly, Jonathan Armstrong, Tom, and myself sat around a virtual table, and we all put together our thoughts on what FCPA ethics and compliance might look like under a Trump administration. And based on that based on that podcast, we thought about committing our ideas to paper. And it's a collection of essays that each one of us wrote directly after the elections. And I think we're planning on trying to release one of these a quarter. Is that correct, Tom?
Right. So Maurice Gilbert at Corporate Compliance Insights, a great friend of both of us and a great friend of the compliance profession, graciously agreed to publish our ebook and put it up on his site, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But Maurice had what I thought, Jay, was the inspired idea of this is just the first part of the conversation, and he wants us to continue the conversation. So we are going to dedicate probably a podcast a quarter on the Everything Compliance podcast to the issue of Trump and compliance. We will all continue to write. It will be analysis, predictions, and the occasional rant from the X-Men of Compliance. So I'm really looking forward to it. Maurice has graciously agreed to continue to publish it. It's available at no cost. So I hope everyone will go over to Maurice's site and download the publication, because it certainly puts everything in one place for you. Gives you our thoughts on where we're going. We link Maurice links to the podcast if you have not heard Everything Compliance, the Trump and Compliance edition. I hope you will check it out. So I know I'm looking forward to it, and really Maurice, with the inspired idea that this is just the start of the conversation, allows us to continue this conversation and continue to track the twists and turns of the Trump administration, at least as they relate to compliance. So I'm definitely looking forward to it, Jay.
Yeah, it's going to be good stuff. Another piece of housekeeping that I just wanted to pick up before we get into the meat of today's podcast is back in mid-November, you had attended a very interesting program, an FCPA mock trial, and I was wondering, I think we weren't able to speak about this because it fell during Thanksgiving. So do you have a few moments to share some thoughts about that?
Sure. So Keith Hennessy came up with this idea of putting on a FCPA mock trial, and he was joined by Joel Androphy of the law firm of Berg and Androphy. Keith is with Gibbons and Johnston here in Houston, and they put on the first annual FCPA Mock Trial Institute. And day one was a FCPA mock trial, but day two was really the inspired part, Jay. It was analysis and commentary by not only the participants, but a wide variety of practitioners and commentators who talked about what they saw at trial, more importantly, how a general counsel or a chief compliance officer would think through the issues of going to trial. I led a panel on ethical issues around FCPA investigations and a panel on journalists how they might cover a trial. And we had traditional newspaper investigative print journalists. We had more social media blogger journalists. We had journalists who write long-form articles and books. So we had a wide variety of journalists who talked about what would interest them in a trial, how they would cover it, what's the difference in a kind of bet the company Enron case down to just a more traditional white-collar case, which this was. So I thought it was very interesting, a lot of good insights. Joel Androphy, he's a white-collar criminal defense lawyer in Houston, and he, after the first day, he asked me, well, Tom, what was your general sense, or what was sort of your first thoughts? And I looked at him and I said, Joel, I don't want this to sound banal, but, this is just a trial. It's just a trial like every other trial, and you prepare for it, you assess your risks, you evaluate the case, and you go to trial. And he looked at me and said, that's exactly what I've been trying to communicate to corporations, that it's just a trial. And so for me, that was the real key takeaway that, hey, boys and girls, this is not a bet the company. This is not, oh, you're going to trial against the biggest government in the world that is the Frankenstein monster of prosecutors that are going to destroy you. It's just a trial. And so that's really maybe changed my thinking because, as you would know, because I'm from Houston, I do think about Enron and I do think about Arthur Andersen, and those companies no longer exist. So Enron because they engaged in the fraud, and Arthur Andersen because they helped cover it up and went to trial defending themselves. So it was a really interesting exercise. I hope they will do it again, and I certainly learned quite a bit from it. So the next thing up is another book release I wanted to talk about, Jay, because our good friend Matt Ellis, and I would emphasize the next word, finally issued or released his first book. And I say that because I have been on him for years to do this. He writes an excellent blog at FCPA Americas, along with his colleague Carlos Ayers. And Matt has collected some of his top posts and provided just fabulous commentary and other resources in a book called The FCPA in Latin America. Jay, I was privileged to go to Matt's opening book release and book signing this past week in Washington. I would note that the book was published by, once again, our good friend Maurice Gilbert at Corporate Compliance Insights. But Matt had the book has a foreword by the dean of the FCPA bar, Homer Moyer, at Miller and Chevalier, where Matt is a partner. And Homer spoke. Matt graciously asked me to speak because I wrote a back cover introduction for him as well. And it was a great event, very well attended. Interestingly, his mother and sister were there. So I found that interesting. And his mom was just beaming with pride. I spent a fair amount of time talking to her. Got to meet his wife. They have an 18-month-old son who was not in attendance. So I didn't get to meet their son. But very much a family affair. Professionals literally from across the globe attended. Got to meet a lot of Matt's partners at Miller that I had communicated with over the phone. over the years. So it was a great event. We will link to it once again in the show notes. It's available on Amazon. I believe it's available both in hardcover or traditional book form, and it's also available in eBook. If you have any interest or even desire to know about corruption, anti-corruption enforcement and laws in Latin America, this is the book for you. If you're doing business in Latin America, you have to have this book. So kudos to Matt for getting it out. It's a great read. I've gotten through about half of it in about 3 days. So I hope we'll take a look at it.
Well, it sounds like it was a great event, and I also have that same experience. Once Matt was moderating a Brazilian FCPA panel at Baker and McKenzie in D.C., and there was probably 10 or 15 folks who I'd had only LinkedIn relationships with, and they also came out from Brazil just for these events. So there is a large contingent of anti-corruption folks in Brazil who are vibrant members of our community. And it looks like we are going to have a new leader on the FCPA, what will we call it, list of companies who have had to pay up. And this is just a preview of something we'll be watching in the next few weeks. But it appears that Odebrecht and their affiliate Braskem are looking at paying $2.5 billion, and that's with a B, fine for their actions during Operation Car Wash. And that blows past the highest settlement on record, which is $1.6 billion that was paid by Siemens, with $800 million to the U.S. government and $800 million to the German government. So it'll be very interesting to see. So much of the FCPA world has been focused on Brazil for the last 3 years. So I think the timing of Matt's book is perfect for this.
Absolutely. So our good friend Barry Vitou, a partner at Pinson Masons in the United Kingdom, in London specifically, gave an interview to Richard Bistrong about the future of the UK Serious Fraud Office. And Jay, I was wondering what some of your takeaways may have been from that interview. And it's available on the FCPA Blog website. We'll link to that in the show notes. But could you maybe give our listeners a preview or your thoughts on what Barry talked about?
Yeah, I think, since Barry was at the SFO and now he's in private practice at Pinson Masons, he really has a very good handle on where the SFO's been and where it's going to go. And there seems to be a bit of a kerfuffle going on here about whether or not the SFO is going to be under their own auspices or if it's going to get combined under another governmental body that's fighting corruption and crime. The British, kind of like Barry, have a very measured approach to things. And, they are not moving at the speed that the DOJ and the SEC are, but they are in a bit of a newer positions. And one of the key takeaways I took from the exchange between Barry and Richard was that several years ago, I don't think anyone in the UK ever would have imagined that there would be cases brought to light involving companies like Rolls-Royce and Tesco and GlaxoSmithKline. So I think that's really a measure of the progress that the SFO has been making. And, there's probably a lot of other British companies and other global companies that they're looking at that we might not even know about right now. So I think the takeaway was that the SFO is doing just fine and they're here to stay.
Yeah, I got that as well. And the other point that Barry said was that although Theresa May in the past has made statements that might indicate that she believes the SFO should be rolled into other British regulatory bodies, she really has a lot more on her plate right now than the SFO. And much with President Trump and a lot of the promises he's made, and the Republican majority in Congress have said they're going to try to enact immediately, modifying or repealing, rather, even modifying the FCPA may be far down their list. And the legislative process itself for Theresa May to change the SFO because it has a legislative charter may not be a priority, and may be something that is the process would take so long that is something that just would just not come to pass, and that may actually inform what could happen to the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act.
I completely agree. So seems like we're running a little bit long. Let's quickly drop into some of the officials from the DOJ and the SEC that spoke this week at American Conference Institute's 33rd annual FCPA Conference. And I'd like to jump in with a summary of some thoughts from both Deputy Assistant Attorney General Sally Yates, and then also from the SEC part of the things, Andrew Ceresny's remarks. And, in what may have felt and sounded like a valedictory address, Deputy AG Yates recalled her professional lifelong battle against corruption. And in her address, she detailed how her namesake memo brought out the concept of voluntary self-disclosure, and how this has, in effect, become a 10th standalone Phillip factor. And next, she went on to talk about how recent enforcement actions have made it very clear that there's a difference in treatment for those companies who self-disclose versus those who don't. She also shared with the community that there's a new resource available, which is www.justice.gov/individual-accountability. And this is a place where companies and the FCPA bar can go to see current information about where the government is thinking about things. And she also counseled that it's just as easy and probably more efficient if you pick up the phone and call your friendly AUSA. I'm not sure how many people would do that. Finally, she closed with the prediction that in the coming months, we will see a higher percentage of cases accompanied by criminal or civil actions against individuals. And my takeaway from her remarks, which I posted on LinkedIn earlier this week, was that, quote, individual accountability isn't a Democratic or Republican principle, but it's a core value of our criminal justice system that perseveres regardless of which party is in power. Next, to jump to Andrew Ceresny's remarks, and he again struck on four key, themes. This was his fourth year attending the annual conference in D.C. First of all, he used the Harris Corporation's favorable resolution as being a direct result of self-reporting, and he also noted that the company found bad actors and began remediating almost within 5 months of owning the company. So really, for them to get the result they got, it was about them really being transparent and self-reporting and coming to the government with individual actors. Next, he turned focus onto the Ox-Zif African bribery matter, and he thought this was a great case to look at how the spotlight is being shown on the C-suite, and there was accountability for both the CEO, Daniel Locke, and CFO, Joel Frank. Next, he talked about one of our favorite subjects, the sons and daughters case, and where he chose to focus his view was that in the past, we've had this term, anything of value, and it was thought to be of too broad a nature to actually give it a name. But he feels that it now has a specific meaning, especially when anything of value could equal hiring a sons and daughter, which translated to over $100 million worth of investment banking mandates for JP Morgan. And he said this matter also led to a sweep in Asia Pacific, and brought in companies like Qualcomm and BNY Mellon. Finally, the last point he addressed was international cooperation and global settlements. And as examples, he took recent cases, both Vimpcom and Embraer. He fully expects to see more global settlements involving foreign authorities in the coming years. And I think both Yates and Ceresny took this opportunity to clearly spell out for the FCPA enforcement bar, as well as their clients, how the DOJ, SEC, and growing numbers of global partners who continue to collaborate to bring actions against companies, as well as individual actors who are involved with corruption. So I know sometimes we sound like a broken record by saying, look at the declination, look at an NPA or a DPA to see the government's expectations of what you need to bring to them. And I think, in this year, we have really clarified, and with the decisions that have been made, they've really added a lot more information that needs to be taken into a company's calculus when they have to decide whether they disclose or not.
So, Jay, what I'd like to do is focus on the remarks. At first, I should say that I'm going to link to both of their speeches. The text of their remarks have been made available, and we'll have those. But also, Kara Brockmeyer, head of FCPA enforcement from the Securities and Exchange Commission, and Daniel Kahn, who heads up the DOJ's FCPA unit, also spoke. Unfortunately, their remarks were not they're not available via text, or the text of their remarks are not available, I should say. But I did listen to their remarks, and there are a couple of things I'd like to highlight for you, Jay. From Kara, there's been a clear uptick in SEC enforcement actions. She said there have been 21 to date. The first SEC DPA with an individual and 2 NPAs, so that there were actually 24 enforcement actions in total. Although this is the second highest so far, she anticipates that enough will come down the pike in the rest of the month that this will be the highest number of cases for SEC enforcement. She also talked interestingly, there's been some critique or outright criticism around the FCPA part of the whistleblower program because the numbers are so small vis-a-vis total whistleblower reports. And I don't have the total number of whistleblower reports this year, or at least of the last SEC calendar year. But to date, or through that year, there are 238 relating to the FCPA. And if you think about that, Jay, 238 separate reports of potential FCPA violations. And when you look at that raw number, frankly, that's huge. Because look at the enforcement actions, 24 through the first 11 months of the year. There could be a significant backlog and uptick in SEC FCPA enforcement actions going forward. Another key difference is that the Yates memo applies to the Department of Justice. The SEC still use something called the seaboard factor. Dan Kahn talked to us about the FCPA year from the DOJ's perspective. There have been 8 corporate resolutions. There have been 10 individual resolutions. Obviously, the pilot program announced in April has been a very significant part of the DOJ's year. He talked about the different factors of the pilot program, and that the pilot program, he believes, has led to more transparency in how companies got a discount, what remediation steps they've taken. He contrasted the discount given to J.P. Morgan, even though J.P. Morgan did not self-report, with that, which was not given to Embraer, because the Embraer did not fully remediate the case. He also mentioned the 2 declinations which were given, which required profit disgorgement, and acknowledged that was something new for the Department of Justice as well. The one thing, though, that, Jay, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on is the following. They both talked about law enforcement going global. And I had been one of the ones, or I guess when I heard about global enforcement previously, I thought of global cooperation. So if you look at the bottom of every SEC and DOJ press release, they will discuss or list who has provided assistance. And there have been now 3 conferences in the United States where the SEC and the DOJ have basically put on week-long training sessions for prosecutors from other countries about how to prosecute corruption cases separate and apart from other white-collar financial crimes or just traditional cases. And they both said that the sophistication of the international prosecutorial community is becoming quite a bit higher. And this year we really saw some of the fruits of that, specifically Embraer and Vimpelcom. There were payments to foreign countries for the enforcement efforts in those countries. Embraer paid $20 million in Brazil. Vimpelcom paid $397 million to Dutch authorities. A fellow named Geert Vermeulen talked about this in more depth and at greater length in an FCPA blog post this week, where he talked about the dramatic increase in Dutch anti-corruption enforcement efforts because of U.S. help. And he actually listed several of the cases that have been brought in Holland because of specifically the guidance or training that the U.S. Justice Department and Securities and Exchange Commission had put on. These were not all FCPA cases, but they were general corruption cases. So I thought that was really interesting. All of this leads me to the following, Jay, that even if on January 22nd, even if Donald Trump with a pen could overturn and revoke the FCPA, it would not matter for any company doing business outside the United States, because other countries are going to pick up the enforcement effort. And there is recognized to be one pot of money relating to fines and penalties. And the effort put in by the individual enforcement agencies leads to the equitable allocation of the fines and penalties to the countries at question. The United States right now can lead that discussion. But even if President Trump could overturn the FCPA, which he can't, but other countries are going to pick up the enforcement efforts. So if you're a U.S. business doing business outside of the United States, you still have to have a compliance program in place because it's your only possible defense to a corruption claim. So I was really intrigued by this. The phrase they used was one pie and the equitable distribution of that pie. I think Dan Kahn, using the Yates memo as a starting point, which Sally Yates called the individual accountability memo, talked about the U.S. may reshift its focus to individuals now and allowing other countries to go after corporations. That might mean greater fines and publicity to international enforcement agencies or enforcement agencies from those countries outside the United States, which could lead to greater compliance across the globe. So certainly an effort to be applauded, but for the compliance practitioner who may be listening to this and is still worried, even though you've listened to our Everything Compliance podcast, even though you have downloaded our ebook, Trump and Compliance from CCI, the United States enforcers in the persons of the DOJ and the SEC have worked very diligently so other countries will begin to enforce their anti-corruption laws. And the need for compliance programs, and compliance professionals will only grow.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree, Tom. I was just, as you were just so eloquently pulling all that stuff together, I just started to think back into when the wave used to start at a baseball game or a football arena, and there's that classic scene in Harry Met Sally where Billy Crystal's talking to the other guy and they have to keep getting up every second and doing the wave. And I think, or I know that we've started a wave, and whether it's, the FBI, the DOJ, the SEC, there is a common agreement across the world that corruption is bad. And whether or not we will be the direct party doing the investigation and, finding them, we do have worldwide partners who are now working on this. And, I think it's very encouraging. So I'd like to be a little bit, more sanguine and say that, regardless of what the Trump administration does, and that will be, looking at over the first year very closely and over the whole 4 years, I think as a whole, the anti-corruption movement is, it's the gate is open, and it's not, we can't put the genie back in the bottle. The last thing, since I've had music on my mind when I was thinking about the clash a couple weeks with should I stay or should I go, and after taking the remarks of Sally Yates and Andrew Ceresny, I got a little Broadway on them, and in my mind I started to hear this refrain from Les Mis, and it says, "Do you hear the people singing the songs of angry men? It's the music of a people who will not be slaves again." So I think that is where I'm feeling about the FCPA and international enforcement this week, December 2nd, 2016.
Your wave analogy brought up something else for me, which is how about them Cowboys? 11-1, beat Minnesota in an ugly game last night. And unfortunately for your folks, I think we have to think about and discuss the impact of the Gronk injury.
We do. And, Mr. It is what it is, and we're on to L.A. Belichick's perspective is the next man up. And, when we've got the two tight ends in there, it's a very different offense, and there's mismatches that Bennett and Gronk can have. But I think now you're going to shift to the three wide receiver package. The more important offensive weapon is going to be Julian Edelman, but you've got Danny Amendola, you've got the guy they got from Buffalo, and then you also have a rookie in there who got two TD passes last week. So as long as Brady's up and mobile, New England will find a way to win, and they also really will start to need some contributions from the defensive side of the ball. This year, they have not had the number of turnovers that they usually have. They've played clean ball on the offensive side, but they need to be a little bit more opportunistic defensively.
So are you still feeling good for at least home field advantage?
Yeah. I mean, I think we're 2 games up in the loss column, and if we take care of business in the division, we should be in good shape. So I'm feeling good, and I think we could go back to the future and have the Oakland Raiders in New England for another snowball game, and we could have the Tuck Rule Redux Part 2.
Exactly. That's exactly what I was contemplating. I never thought the Cowboys would be at 11-1. I thought the Giants, who seem to have turned it around, would be the class of the NFL, and I thought we might be looking at trip threes for Brady and Eli Manning in the Super Bowl. But I can't pull against my Cowboys now that we are leading the league. So, and of course, if Cowboys are in the Super Bowl, who I'm going to be pulling for. So. Anyway,
well, I'm definitely on the Cowboys bandwagon. Number one, because Millie always liked the star on the helmet. But number two, it's at a little bit of personal risk because Mrs. Translations, we know, is from outside the D.C. area, and she's a big Redskins fan. So even in spite of what may or may not happen to me, Tom, I'm pulling for the Cowboys. Don't tell anyone.
Well, on that note, Jay, I think we ought to wrap this week. It's been a great and interesting week in FCPA. I hope you will join us again. You have any final thoughts for us, Jay?
Go Patriots, go Cowboys.
I could not have said it better myself.